Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Some of you sailed with me on the Titanic back in April, and now we're here for vampires. So it shows that I'm not the only one that has such a wide range of interests because, to go from the Titanic or Prohibition and history of liquor to vampires is a bit of a jump for some people. And I've been doing variations of this lecture for years, and it usually does not get that big of a crowd. It's a real niche subject, so you guys are weird in Woodbridge, I guess. You're all into this, so yeah. That could be, I could see a hashtag now, weird in Woodbridge. So as for me, I'm a historian first and foremost. I'm also a paranormal investigator. I've investigated many historic sites that are haunted, and with the interest in ghosts comes an interest in history because we're looking to talk to people that once existed before us. And then when getting interested in that, it also spins me down in a direction of folklore and legends and myths, some of them which are very central to New Jersey and very local where we are now, and others a little bit more far away, such as vampires. Most of what we're talking tonight is going to be in Eastern Europe, but some of it is going to be right here in the United States and in a time period that you would not be expecting. Like I said before, this is a niche subject, so it's very good to see such a big crowd, and it's the perfect time of year. And of course, this venue, as Gothic styled as it is the best place to be talking about vampires. So here we go. I want to start off with a question, something that you can all just contemplate as we look at vampires, the myth, the legends, the stories, and also other aspects of history throughout time. Why do cultures around the world share similar myths and legends despite no communication with each other? And when we think of the vampire, I think we think of Transylvania, we think of maybe Vlad the Impaler, we think of Bela Lugosi and that accent of his that's become so synonymous with vampires. But in reality, it goes back a little bit farther than that, and it spans across many different cultures. And you can look throughout history at different myths, at different types of construction. Why are there pyramids all over the world when those cultures haven't communicated with each other? We have vampires in the Bible. Technically, Lilith can be considered a vampire. In Chinese folklore, the Jiangshi, which is about as scary as it looks right there, probably the most terrifying looking vampire image you would see in any study of the topic, also has the ability to transform into a wolf, which is something that is synonymous with vampires, the ability to change form and transfer. So for thousands of years across many cultures, including in India with Kali, technically a vampire who consumes blood. The Aztecs had a vampire god, and not necessarily referring to these creatures or these persons as vampires, but the same basic idea that something can not only take your blood, but also have the power over you once it consumes your blood. And we have probably the most well-known vampire, at least to us, Bela Lugosi, and I brought him with me tonight, little mini Bella. So he comes with me to all my vampire talks. I'm going to put him here so he can watch all of you. You can get him. There's a collectible store. I can't remember if it was the Woodbridge Mall or the Menlo Park Mall. There's a collectible store. They have him, Frankenstein, the Mummy. They don't have the Invisible Man because that would just be an empty box, I guess. But so you can pick him up. It's a great gift idea for Christmas. So there he is. He's looking right at you, ma'am. So to study vampires, it's history and myth intertwined with each other. It's impossible to study the history without the myths. It's impossible to study the myths without the history because sometimes the myths are history and the history is the myth because we're dealing with creatures that did not exist. Of course, there is no such thing as a real vampire, something that will suck your blood and live forever. But there are people that have believed in such creatures. And it's the same thing when you're studying witchcraft from back in the day, studying the Inquisition, that we have this idea when we look back with our modern views to think that these people throughout history, oh, they were so foolish, they were stupid. How could anybody believe somebody could get on a broom and fly across the neighborhood? How could somebody believe you could turn into a black cat or live for 500 years in a coffin and just drink the blood of people in order to stay alive? But these were real views over the years, and so it's better, or it's more important, at least for me as a historian and those that are interested in this, to try to put yourself into the mindset of somebody that was around in the 1500s or 1600s or 1700s, and that might creep you out a little bit more, because we have to block out all that we know and try to get into that mindset that, wow, maybe these creatures are real. And this did develop a genuine fear in people as time went on. The official dictionary definition of the word vampire is the reanimated body of a dead person believed to come from the grave at night and suck the blood of persons asleep. And this is Eastern European in origin, from vampire, vampire, and vampire again with no E. And one of the earliest vampire movies is called Vampire, from the 1930s. It was made after the Bela Lugosi version, which I highly recommend for you to check out. All of these guys are connected. They're all different, but they are connected. And when you look at one, you look at the other. And this is why it sounds like kind of weird to say that when you look at the old Universal horror movies with Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, they did such a great job in incorporating lore and myths that people genuinely believed into film. Of course, these movies are fictitious, but they did a great job in capturing that essence, especially in the Frankenstein and Dracula movies being set in Eastern Europe. So for these three, we have the major differences, of course. Vampires are immortal unless killed. Witches, they are mortal. When they die, their spirit may remain as a witch and haunt as a ghost. Werewolves, they too are immortal unless killed. They can live forever. There's various ways of killing each of these three. Witches are the most human of them all and can be killed quite easily. Vampires need a stake through the heart. Werewolves need a silver bullet. There's other ways of killing them, but when you study folklore, they all manage to pop up in some of the same stories in the same circles, and some of them were kind of mentioned almost interchangeably, especially in some of the older folk tales. And these tales are born out of fear. And it's very hard for us to imagine, and very cliche, that we're kind of spoiled by what we have here, that we're here, we have electric lights on, we have street lights when we go down the street. We don't really think anything of it because we've always had that. But when you think back for most of human history, people have not had that. When you went out at night, there was nothing but total darkness. If there was a cloudy sky and there was no moon to be seen, you were in total darkness. And it is this darkness that creates such a fear in people, especially in Eastern Europe. Very isolated pockets of population, thick forests, and legends and stories. And when you go out at night, well, you shouldn't be going out at night because that's when the devil comes out to play. These legends will thrive in a fear of the unknown. Maybe started out as bedtime stories to keep your children in order, like, oh, don't leave the house at night because the witch at the end of the street will get you. But then that gets repeated time after time, and it becomes believed to be truth, and as we know now, that would be considered folklore. There are still some villages in Romania today that take vampires, that hang garlic in their windows, that make sure that when a person dies, they're brought out of the house in a certain way, and we're going to go over all that in a few minutes. I don't want it to seem like all of Romania is like that, but the really rural areas still have this belief. Or maybe they don't truly believe it, but it's that tradition that they've always grown up with and that their parents and grandparents have grown up with. And the nighttime darkness in which all of this fostered was literally the place where the devil came out to play, where evil could thrive, because when you opened your front door, you look out and you see nothing but darkness. And then there was the very practical fear that you could get robbed or attacked being outside traveling at night. And so you made sure to be wherever you had to be by sunset. You did not go out after the sun went down, and you waited until morning. This then kind of thrived and galloped along to, well, when you leave the house during the middle of the night, that's where the vampires will get you. Maybe that's where the witches will get you. And we also have to consider the religion and the superstition of the people. These were people that were very devout in their beliefs and literally blamed anything that went wrong was the fault of the devil, or the fault of people consorting with the devil. And on the contrary, anything that was good happened because people were well behaved and they were praying and believing in God. And that's why, for example, the harvest went well. When the harvest failed, maybe it was witchcraft. Maybe it was because people were consorting with the devil. Rural Romania today is very similar to how it has been throughout much of history, to when Bram Stoker writes Dracula. And raise your hand if you've seen Nosferatu, the original silent. Okay, great. That will capture the essence of vampiric belief better than almost any other horror movie, because it shows what the people truly believed, and that was not necessarily a vampire specifically had to bite you in order to cause you to turn into a vampire. There were many different ways you could turn into a vampire, and in Nosferatu, his bites don't necessarily create more vampires. He starts a plague, and that plague ravages the village. That's what gets the people scared and eventually end up attacking him. It is custom in some areas of Romania to exhume the dead 3 days after burial, just to make sure that the body has been, quote, received by the earth. And what this means are typical signs of decomposition. And it is decomposition and standard scientific facts we know today is why there has been so much confusion over history as to why certain people were perceived as being vampires. We know today that when you don't embalm a body, we decompose. And there's a certain expected level of decomposition after 3 days. Now, we also know that there might be some rare cases where, depending on where the body was buried, maybe there was low humidity, maybe it was very dry, maybe the temperature was extra cold, that the body does not decompose at the rate that it should. And so when the body is dug up, if they're still looking nice and fresh, it might be because they're still feeding on the living and they are a vampire. And so it is determined that 3 days is a long enough amount of time to check and see if the person is starting to rot, and if they are, they have been received by the earth and they are not a vampire. In Romania, you might become a vampire if the body is not removed from the house head first. You catch a glimpse of the body being removed from the place of death. They don't say anything about the people carrying the body out, because they're watching it being carried out. And also, if an animal crosses in front of the procession, the funeral procession, that person that is dead might become a vampire. This is Romania today. This looks very similar to when Vlad the Impaler ruled over it, and we're going to do a whole profile on him in a little bit. That's my favorite part of tonight's presentation. It looks very similar. I haven't been to Romania, but if you have, I imagine that you'll be seeing exactly the same thing as what people have seen over the last 500 years. Where is Romania? It's right here, Eastern Europe, very importantly located in terms of when Vlad the Impaler comes along, because it is almost in the middle, separating the Christian world from the Muslim world in terms of back in the Crusades. And so Romania is going to be a hotbed for attacks, for views, for politics, and this is all going to play into Vlad Dracula when I get to him in a little bit. Now, when looking at the individuals, trying to figure out, is somebody a vampire? It's the same thing with witches. They would bring somebody in during interrogation, strip you naked, and they would check your body. And if you had a big or abnormal looking birthmark, that was the mark of the witch. Sometimes they would test it further by sticking a pin into the birthmark, and if you did not bleed, you were a witch. Of course, again, scientifically, sometimes you can stick yourself with a needle and not bleed. It's just depending on where you have it, how thick maybe the scab or birthmark is, you would have been considered a witch. But we have the same marks here for vampires. A reanimated corpse, of course, that's the most obvious, but people feeling weak, whether somebody has just died and they were considered a vampire, the rest of the village or the rest of the family members start feeling weak. Maybe somebody in the village is accused of being a vampire and those around them feel weak. It is because the host is feeding off of them, whether directly by blood or by energy. And there is another term, it is called to be a psychic vampire. It does not mean you can see the lottery numbers and you're also a vampire, but it means you are after the energy, that you can simply get your fill by just putting your hands on somebody and draining the energy. And there are people that feel that they could just be around somebody and they have this power, this ability to drain their life and drain their energy. I think we've all had coworkers like that throughout our lives that just, suck everything out of you. Of course, there's immense power over the individuals they feed from, whether it's just the energy or whether it's a bite. It's standard in almost every vampire story we see. Once you are bitten, you are weakened, but you are also under the spell of the vampire that bit you. And these are, of course, all immortal unless killed, various ways to kill a vampire, which we're going to go over in a little bit. Now, medically, scientifically, can the dead return to life? And this is something that people have asked for years. It's something that tormented Edgar Allan Poe, the thought of being buried alive. Tormented a lot of people, especially in the 1800s and the Victorian era. People had all kinds of contraptions built into their coffins to prevent themselves from being buried alive. Had they woken up inside, they could maybe ring a bell or push a button and get the attention. And so, not just in the case of vampires, but in general, there is this real fear of being buried alive, and there's this real fear of the dead returning to life. We do have some documented cases of the dead coming to life. And the best example of this would have been a man named James Spalding, who in Scotland in 1632, he was executed for a crime. I don't remember it, but they hung him from a tree. And it was just a rudimentary. They had him stand on a cart, rope around his neck, kicked out the cart. He fell, he was hanged, and he was buried. A couple of days later, they saw James Spalding walking through their village. His hair was a mess. He had, bruising on his face. He didn't look well. He was barely able to speak. He was kind of like, how does zombies go, oh, like that? And he was walking around like that. His eyes were messed up, and people freaked out because they thought he was a member of the undead. He had returned as a vampire. But what probably really happened was that we know there is science to hanging somebody. It's something that this country actually perfected in the Old West. You have to fall from a certain distance. The knot has to be specific. You fall, it snaps your neck, you die instantly. You're not supposed to strangle to death. It's the breaking of the neck that is supposed to kill you. And so it's possible to hang somebody, and they're up there for maybe even a couple of minutes, and they are still alive, slowly strangulating. And then when they are seen to be dead, they get cut down and buried when they were never dead to begin with, but simply just knocked unconscious. He then managed, because he wasn't buried 6 feet under, to push through the earth. He was not even buried in a coffin, and he was probably only speaking in groans because of severe brain damage due to oxygen loss. And so what they would have seen back then as a clear case of the undead stalking their village, today we would have explanations for that medically. And that's the case probably for most of the people that have been seen coming back to life throughout Eastern Europe. They were most likely premature burials, and it takes until the 20th century for people to fully grasp what it means to be clinically dead. It's almost impossible to bury somebody alive today, especially if you're in a hospital. We know all your vital signs, and if you get embalmed, well, if you were still alive then, you are certainly dead by the time they drain the blood and all of that good stuff from you. And so today, to bury somebody alive, most likely not going to happen. There are people that don't get embalmed, and maybe they die at home without all of the vital signs being checked, but that probably explains it throughout most of history. Vampire epidemics are going to spring up across Europe in the 1700s. And it's funny because we had just finished with the Inquisition. We had just gotten over the witch trials. And I'm going to touch on that in a second. And there's this switch that it's like throughout history, we've always needed something to fear. And for 300 years, it was witches. Well, now we don't really believe in witches so much. Now there has to be some other type of creature, and it's going to become the vampire. There were signs of a person being a vampire other than the obvious. One would be insomniacs were targeted because they were walking around at night. Maybe they just went for a walk. They couldn't sleep. They go for a walk in the neighborhood. Oh, why is John walking around at 2 a.m? He must be up to no good. He must be looking for somebody to feed off of. Meanwhile, the guy just can't sleep. We don't have Lunesta yet. The butterfly swoops in and puts you to sleep. We don't have that yet. Bodies will be exhumed as villages and family members of some of the deceased become afraid and worried that the person that they love so much that is dead might be a vampire. So we have to dig them up just to be sure. Other signs, bless you, other signs we would look at when these bodies were exhumed: fingernails continuing to grow, hair continuing to grow. I think it's a myth we probably all heard at one point in our life that when you die, your hair and fingernails continue to grow. And that may look like that, but it's because your skin starts to pull back, your scalp pulls back, and it looks like your fingernails and your hair are growing. They would also look at the bodies in the coffin and see blood around the corners of the mouth, looking like maybe they had just been feeding off of somebody. Bloating in the stomach, which we know today. When you die and you're not embalmed, you do bloat, but it would give the appearance of being well fed. Movement in the coffin. Maybe the person was buried perfectly like this, but when they were disinterred, the hands were moved or the body was turned. Again, without embalming, gases expanding, contracting, the body can move in the coffin. And it even happened during wakes back before embalming, where a body might burp or move in front of a room full of people, which would probably terrify everybody in the room temporarily until they realized what it was. And also, when touching the body, especially when being sure by driving a stake through their heart, just in case, the body groaning, which is also gas being emitted from the diaphragm. All signs that we would know today. It was supposed to be the end of an era, or an error, however you want to phrase it, with the witch trials. We just finished them in the late 1600s into the early 1700s. There were a couple of countries in Europe, Hungary in particular, that kept their witch trials going until 1777, which, just think, we were reaching enlightenment in some parts of the world, United States declaring our independence, and yet there were still countries that were pursuing witches. What we did see for 200 years, including our very own Salem witch trials, over 110,000 people persecuted as suspected witches in Europe between the early 1500s and early 1700s. And we see a rough estimate, which is probably low, of 60,000 people being executed as supposed witches. And by the mid-1700s, and even in this country, certain municipalities began apologizing for the witch trials. In Salem, one of the chief magistrates, about 10 years after the witch trials took place in Salem, issued a formal apology, basically saying that we were wrong and we are sorry. We know witches do not really exist. We were swept up by hysteria. The devil made us do it, so on and so forth. And in the same breath, as these people are apologizing for killing so many people as witches that they now knew were not real, they are now hunting vampires. And it's kind of mind-boggling in that sense to look at it, that, well, witches aren't real, or vampires real? Can they both be real, or are they both fake? There's skepticism in witchcraft. There's skepticism in black magic. No, you can't just turn into a black cat and go prancing around the neighborhood, but you can now all of a sudden become a vampire. And we see, like, the Malleus Maleficarum was written in the 1400s, which was your DIY idiot's guide to killing witches for the time. It laid out very specific methods of interrogation, methods of torture, execution, how to identify a witch. Well, in 1756, Catholic Church released a vampire hunting book, which kind of modeled itself after the Malleus Maleficarum, and basically outlined how do you kill a vampire. 1, wooden stake or metal bolt through the heart, a sword or scythe to cut off the head. You can do both just to be sure. Stake through the heart, bam, cut off the head. And some Eastern European countries managed to do this anyway, even if somebody was not suspected of being a vampire, because you never can be too sure if your loved one is going to come back from the dead. We see vampire hunting kits released, and it's kind of funny, like what you would see in the movie when Van Helsing has his little briefcase along, and these are real things. They pop up in antique stores and auctions every once in a while, and they can go for a lot of money. Guns with silver bullets, crosses, garlic, wolfbane, which doesn't just repel werewolves, but it also repels vampires. And, I mean, could you imagine in the 17 and 1800s, which is really not that long ago in the grand scheme of human history, people walking around with this thing looking for vampires? We have archaeological evidence of this. We see here somebody was buried, they were discovered, there is a bolt through the heart. This person had not only their head removed by a scythe, but the scythe was left in place in the grave to prevent them from still rising. They must have been really afraid of this one to still leave the blade in place. Other examples, a bolt through the jaw. This person's head was actually removed and then placed, the skull placed on the person's legs in the grave, and there's actually two different bodies here. And these come up every once in a while. These are all recent discoveries within the last couple of years. They may pop up on your Facebook feed, vampire found in whatever region, and you might go, oh, that's a joke or it's a prank. But sometimes, you got to check that link, and it might be the BBC, it might be National Geographic, and these are, in fact, real discoveries. As for vampires being real cases that we have, we're going to start right here in the United States with the New England vampire panic. Before we get to Vlad and all the good stuff, we're going to go do our own little history first. And this is, again, a question to ask. In America, in the 1800s, between 1793 and 1892, tuberculosis, which was known as consumption, was also, depending on where you lived, again, more rural areas tended to be more superstitious and believe in these things as opposed to the cities where doctors knew better, at least for the time. Through Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Massachusetts, people will be dying of consumption by the thousand. And it's something that just happens. Tuberculosis is a top killer in this country. And it is called consumption because it looks like it actually consumes you. You get weaker and weaker and weaker, you fade, and then you die. And then what ends up happening is those around you get weaker and end up dying. What they would look at that back then is the first person who had tuberculosis was a vampire, and then they gradually infected everybody else in the family. They would then attempt maybe to remove the head of the person or various other means of the first one with tuberculosis. We would see that today as just simply somebody gets sick, you give it to the rest of the family. It happens all the time. But in the United States, in this point in time, if somebody dies from consumption, it is believed that in death, they will return to drain the life of their living relatives. This is a very wild thought that these people really didn't think too highly of their own family, that to automatically assume that, granddad's going to come back and kill you all because he died of consumption. Bodies will be exhumed. There is some beheading, but that's really more for Europe. We liked to cut out organs and burn them as a preventative. Yeah, there's a groan there, yeah. Oh, it's only going to get better from here on out, folks. Some famous examples, 1792, Rachel Burton in Manchester, Vermont. She dies, her husband marries another woman. Second wife started dying, and he said, this is my first wife, come back from the grave to get me. She's trying to kill my new wife. And so they dug up wife number one. They took out some of her organs. They burned them in a blacksmith's forge. 500 people from the town showed up to watch. And what happened? The second wife died anyway. In 1810, corpses disinterred, hearts removed and burned. In 1816, Samuel Saladay, he was disinterred, had his heart and entrails removed and burned in a ceremonial fire in the presence of his family. In 1817, they didn't wait for Frederick Ransom to get buried, but before that, they took it as a preventative to burn his heart also on the blacksmith's forge in front of the entire town. There's even a historic marker in Manchester, Vermont, which notes in the cemetery the Manchester vampire. You can visit Rachel Burton's grave today. People leave dolls and little things by it. In 1873, according to one onlooker, in one family they resorted to that horrible relic of superstition, the burning of the heart, etc. of the dead, and the ashes were swallowed by the survivors in the hopes that the fatal demon would be exorcised from the family, but it did not avail. So the common theme, the more crazy these rituals get, they're still seeing the same result. They're digging up somebody to prevent somebody else from dying that's sick, and what happens? They end up dying anyway. And this culminates with probably the last recorded of such vampire cases in this country, Mercy Brown in 1892. She will die of tuberculosis, and in a very standard fashion, other people in the town began falling ill. She was patient zero. She was the first person that got sick. She was the vampire and the reason for this epidemic. And so they blame the Brown family. They want to exhume Mercy. They want to look at her body to see if she shows any signs of vampirism and then do whatever they have to do. And her father is very reluctant at first, but he's got hundreds of people in the town who are angry that their relatives are sick, and it's all your daughter's fault because she's a vampire. So George will reluctantly give permission for Mercy's body to be exhumed, and even though it had been several days, possibly even weeks, the sources do not say, she was found with, quote, blood still in her heart, and she showed little signs of decomposition. Others that had died right around the same time as her, their bodies were decomposed normally. This was seen as an automatic sign of vampirism. They cut out her heart and liver, burned them, mixed the ashes with water. I think Keith Richards did that too with his dad. And then the family members were made to, he snorted them. This one they drank. Family members were made to then drink this mixture to prevent further consumption. Mercy's brother Edwin got sick while all this was happening. He still died. Everybody else that was sick still died. Mercy was still dead, and they learned a valuable lesson, probably, that none of this was real. And we see in this country, anyway, that thought kind of begin to die down. As we're now approaching the 20th century, and people are still digging up bodies looking for ways to prevent vampirism. Henry David Thoreau was traveling through New England while one of these epidemics was underway. And he says, the savage in man is never quite eradicated. I have just read of a family in Vermont who, several of its members having died of consumption, just burned the lungs and heart and liver of the last deceased in order to prevent any more from having it, as a reference to contemporary superstition. When rural Rhode Islanders moved west into Connecticut, locals perceived them as uneducated and vicious, which was partially due to the Rhode Islanders' beliefs in vampirism. Newspapers were also skeptical, calling belief in vampirism an old superstition and a curious idea. Now we go back to Europe. We're going to go back in time. I tried to set these up in levels of gore and violence, and so we're going to gradually get there. Countess Bathory. Real person. Her name has been used in various horror movies as references. She pops up in books and movies and TV shows, but she was in fact a real person. And as we see with even the real Dracula, sometimes the truth really is scarier than the fiction. She is also from Transylvania, and she lives from 1560 to 1614. Like Vlad the Impaler, she's a provincial leader. She was a beautiful woman, and she was said that she was a kind woman, and she married a brutal, horrible, and abusive man. And it was through this marriage to her husband that she underwent a personality change. She will eventually succeed him after his death, and she will learn some of the brutality that he used in his ruling, and also some of her very own anger and trauma and abuse, and applies that to her ruling. She was most likely a lesbian or bisexual, and she had an obsession with youth and remaining young and beautiful through whatever means necessary. And she made sure all of her servants were young and female, and also virgins. What will set her off is something that is a complete accident. And it makes you wonder, had this not happened, would she have ever gone down the path she did, thus giving us one of the most infamous characters in history. She is taking a bath one night, a servant comes over, does something wrong, it annoyed her, and she smacked the servant in the face. And she had a ring on her finger, and she drew blood when she smacked the servant, and she noticed she had that blood on her hand. And she started to kind of rub it around her hands. She started to put it on her face, play around with it a little bit, and she started to feel more youthful. And she felt that if she kept having more and more blood, of young virgins especially, this might conquer her goal, which would be to remain young and beautiful for forever. It also launched an unquenchable thirst for blood, as she would end up having hundreds of people killed just to satisfy this craving. And the blood on her face became her nightly ritual. As today, people that wear makeup, before you go to bed, take your makeup off, right? Well, she was putting blood on her face before she went to bed. And every night, she would go to a different servant, they would drain some blood, maybe they would kill the servant, maybe they would leave the servant alive. But all of this leading to her thinking, this is working. This is the magic Nivea of the 1600s that's keeping me young and beautiful. It got so bad that she eventually started to bathe in the blood, and this resulted in not just draining a couple of ounces here and there from a unsuspecting servant, but having the person killed and drained of as much blood as possible. Over 20 years, she killed, this is what's documented, there may be much more, 600 to 700 servants. And what she would do was she was really a predator in a sense that she would have her staff go into villages and round up peasants who were young, figuring that if they went missing, no one would care as much. And so she killed so many young peasants from the surrounding area that eventually she ran out. And she then started to go after children of the wealthy, children of the aristocracy and the royalty. And it was only after this that people started going, well, where are all of these girls disappearing to? We have to do something about that. So she was killing poor people for years. It was fine. As soon as she went after royalty, that was it. Bathing in blood was not necessarily enough. She began to drink it. And then she would start biting off bits of their flesh. All of this to stay young and beautiful. She had people tortured for her amusement. And she thought she was above the law, but she made that one fatal mistake, which was to start going after people who had parents that mattered, that could do something about this. One account said of her, according to the testimonies, aided by several trusted servants, Elizabeth Bathory amused herself by torturing girls with pincers, needles, razors, knives, red-hot irons, and pokers. Some were plunged into icy streams and frozen to death. Others were starved in the dungeons and torture chambers the Countess had installed in her castle, or smeared with honey and left to be attacked by bees and ants. 2 court officials claimed to have personally witnessed the Countess torture and kill young servant girls. Bathory was also suspected of cannibalism. Now, we'll ask this question when we get to Vlad Dracula as well, and that is, could one person really have done all of this? You do have to take into account that the people writing these stories are her enemies. They are the people that gradually overthrew her. And yes, she was absolutely killing all of these people, but was her brutality really that strong? Or was this written after the fact in order to paint her as more evil? And we're going to get back to that thought in a little bit. Once she is finally captured or found out, she will be put on trial, and they sentenced her to a lifetime of solitary confinement. They walled her up in one of her castle rooms. They just gave her food through a small hole in the wall, and that was it. She could not be executed because, as was the law of the time, you could not kill a noble. Her accomplices, they met worse deaths than her. Any of those who assisted in the killing, the actual killing, were beheaded, burned, and then their ashes were scattered, so they were denied a Christian burial. Those who had helped round up the girls but were not involved in the killing had their fingers torn out and then were burned at the stake. All of them were treated as witches, so they went back to the witchcraft laws, and even though they were not witches, they used that same style of punishment towards her accomplices, and they were all denied a Christian burial. Was she a real vampire? Is it possible to be a real vampire? Do we consider her as such? What we do know is she was probably the world's earliest serial killer, or at least the earliest one that we have information of. And this is something that will expand even more with the man of the hour, Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula. All of this happening roughly within 100, 150 years of each other in the same spot. And I think that says more about the area, the geography, the lifestyle, the thoughts, what people were expecting, how people lived, than it does anything else. That one area of the world managed to harbor all of this brutality. And of course, rulers of various denominations and affiliations have been brutal over the years, but these two being very similar in such a similar spot. Vlad will live for nearly 50 years, until 1476. He was the Prince of Wallachia, similar to Countess Bathory, a province. He was actually long in a line of Catholic soldiers. He was a Catholic warrior, a member of the Crusades. And so when you go to his country today, he is seen as a hero and has been seen as a hero. And in fact, if you read accounts of the day, not written by his enemies, he is seen as a brave warrior and somebody that fought for Christianity against the invading Muslim Turks. Because when you think back to that map I showed you, how close Romania is to Turkey, which was a hotbed during the Crusades. His birth name is Vlad Dracul, sometimes written as Vlad Dracula, and the name itself means Order of the Dragon. So this is all perfectly swirling around this individual, this very real person who eventually became part of literary history. It's all there. The name, the dragon, the satanic implications of dragon being associated with the devil. Dragon in Romania can actually be translated to mean devil. And the times he lives in are very violent. They are very treacherous. And you can say, is he just a product of his time when so many rulers were brutal? How many emperors and pharaohs had tens of thousands of people killed or tortured or imprisoned? We look at Vlad, we kind of set him aside and go, he was especially brutal. But was he really? Is it just because of the volume, or is it because of the methods he used, which we're going to get to in just a second? There is only one portrait of him known to exist, which is this. It's a sketch. For all that he did, there aren't many descriptions of what he actually looked like. There's actually only one quote in all of recorded history that describes what Vlad looked like. And it is said he was not very tall, but very stocky and strong, with a cold, terrible appearance. He had very long eyelashes, which framed large, wide-open green eyes. Bushy black eyebrows made them appear threatening. This was according to a papal prelate who visited Romania. Transylvania in the 1400s, kind of like it is today. You have some cities, but mainly small villages isolated from each other. They're living under constant fear of Muslim invasion. A lot of the cities are actually constructed with walls. They look like castles, and these still exist today. Dracula is loved by his people because of this defense, and he takes a proactive defense of his homeland, going out on campaigns and also being proactive in terms of dealing with invaders. And he will earn his nickname Vlad the Impaler because of his most used method of execution, which was impalement. And he will hold mass impalements on the outskirts of the city, right by the gates, so that way anybody entering would have to see what this man was capable of. Very similar when looking back on history with how the Romans would set up crucified victims, as that was the preferred method of execution for hundreds of years for them, lining the roads on the way to the big cities, mainly in the African and Middle Eastern regions, with crucified victims, so people entering would see what would happen if they misbehaved and did not follow the law. He had 20,000 enemy soldiers impaled on a single day, according to one account, and this was called the Forest of the Dead, because there were so many people impaled on stakes, it looked like there were trees. Only you'd look up even farther and you would realize it is not a forest, but it is people being killed. Impalement is a descendant of crucifixion as a way to kill somebody, and we as people that live today, we have a very common misconception of crucifixion and how that is supposed to kill you. Because the most famous crucifixion there ever was, the person died so quickly. And so it is assumed by people that, how long was Jesus up on the cross? A few hours, he died. Pretty quick, that's it. But in reality, crucifixion was meant to keep you up there for days, possibly. And in fact, it is not the nails through your hands and feet that kill you. You actually end up suffocating because your diaphragm collapses, you cannot hold yourself up anymore, and you suffocate from that. They did not want you to die quickly. And in fact, there was a science to impalement. It wasn't just jamming this thing up somebody's rear and just sticking it through. They did it slowly. They made sure the point was slightly rounded so that they could work its way through the body hopefully without puncturing any organs. It would gradually come out the throat or the mouth, depending on how skilled the impaler was. And you could actually be impaled in this way and live for a couple of days. Because if it didn't hit any internal organs, there'd be some bleeding, but it wouldn't be the mass bleeding that would kill you instantly. Of course, some people died very quickly. Others managed to linger. And this is where the vampire legends kind of spring up from Vlad. That during these mass impalings, he would dine amongst the so-called forests of stakes, that he would have the blood collected in bowls, he would dip his bread and slurp it on down. But did he really do this? These accounts were written by his enemies. We know the impalements were real, but was he really sitting there having blood like gazpacho in bowls brought to him at the table? His enemies, though, because of this scene, you could imagine being a potential invader, seeing this image in front of you. You probably would want to get the hell out of there as fast as you could. And people viewed him as the literal devil, that what human mind could conceive of this? Yes, impalement was common, but to do it to, say, 10 or 20,000 people at the same time. There are two stories associated with Vlad's brutality that, again, maybe they're true, maybe they're not, or exaggerated. Two Turkish ambassadors visited him, and they refused to remove their hats. And Vlad's associate, or whoever was with him, asked them to remove their hats. They refused again, so he had the hats nailed to their heads, thus killing them. The second was a visiting Russian aristocrat who was amongst the forest of the dead and with Vlad, and he complained of the terrible smell. And Vlad then had him impaled on an extra long stake so he'd be above everybody else and would not be able to smell the horrific odor. Some eyewitness accounts, again, are they real, or are they just exaggerated by enemies who are trying to make him seem worse than what he really was? The shocking story of a monster and berserker called Dracula who committed such unchristian deeds as killing men by placing them onto stakes, hacking them to pieces like cabbage, boiling mothers and children alive, and compelling men to acts of cannibalism. And he killed some by breaking them under the wheels of carts. Others, stripped of their clothes, were skinned alive up to their entrails. Others placed upon stakes or roasted on red-hot coals placed under them. Their breasts, their buttocks, in the middle of their entrails with the stake emerging from their mouths in order that no form of cruelty be missing. He stuck stakes in both mothers' breasts and thrust their babies onto them. Finally, he killed others in various ferocious ways, torturing them with many kinds of instruments, such as the atrocious cruelties of the most frightful tyrant could devise. But could one person really have done all of that? It is a fact. Vlad impaled tens of thousands of people, but not that it's false, but it's just unconfirmed that he did all of these things, that he had somebody's hat nailed to their head, that he took children and impaled them on the same stake as their mother. These were all written by his enemies. Actually, every story of brutality outside of the impalings were written after these impalings supposedly happened. And so we have to leave that little bit of leeway there that maybe all of this didn't really happen or happened in a smaller way and was exaggerated. The modern reevaluation of Dracula by historians was actually that his methods were not unusual for the time period, that he was using methods prescribed to him that had been done for hundreds of years. He just did it in greater number. And the opinion of native Transylvanians today is that he did what he had to do, protecting the homeland from invasion. And even today, he is loved in his homeland. There are several castles he stayed in you can visit and spend the night. One of them is called Dracula's Castle, but it wasn't his. He just was there for like a day. It's like a George Washington slept here kind of thing. Vlad, a valiant fighter, a warrior. His wife died. He makes a daring escape from his castle. All of these stories told today. And there is a tourist industry in Romania because of him, because people want to see where he lived. They want to maybe do some paranormal investigating or spend a night at Dracula's castle. He will finally, though, meet his end in 1476. He's finally captured by the same Turkish invaders who he kept at bay for so long. He will not suffer like his victims. They actually just cut off his head and send it to Istanbul, where it was placed on a stake for all to see. The people in Transylvania, because this death did not happen there in front of them, could not believe he was actually dead. There was no way such a powerful man would be killed so mundanely as having his head cut off. And almost immediately, we see legends spring up that Dracula is immortal, that he is living forever. And this kind of goes into the whole vampire being immortal motif that we have seen repeated over and over again. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in Vlad. It's called In Search of Dracula, written in 1972. It is the most in-depth study of the real Dracula ever made. It was integral in my research here. I mean, you could do a whole 2-hour talk just on Vlad himself. The author, Radu Florescu, he just passed away a few years ago. In this book is his search for Dracula's burial site, because this had been a point of contention for so many years. And it was assumed that he was buried at a Catholic monastery in Snagov. But in 1933, when they went into the grave, they only found animal bones there. Now, people saw that and went, wow, he really transformed into an animal. Or you could just say he was never buried there at all, and they just buried a bunch of animal bones there. There are stories associated with the day he was interred in that monastery. The tower collapsed and fell. The monastery is actually surrounded by a lake. All of these stories spring up. In 2014, though, there was a new potential discovery that said he might actually be buried in Italy, because in this crypt, I think outside of Rome, they found Dracula's family crest and dragon insignia. And even though it does not say Dracula, it doesn't have any words at all, there are some people who believe that this is actually Vlad Dracula's grave. How the body would have ended up in Italy, I don't know, but stranger things have certainly happened. So there's a whole school of historians that believe that. As for where he really is, I think that location has probably just been lost to history. He may be resting somewhere now, but we probably will not know. This is the monastery where it was assumed that he would be buried, as you can see, surrounded by a lake. And when Florescu was writing this book, there's a documentary also made about this whole journey through Transylvania. They experienced paranormal activity while up on Dracula's castle. There were bolts of lightning that seemed to come out of nowhere, and weird balls of light that descended upon them as they tried to climb up the hill to visit the castle. Florescu's own uncle fell and died while climbing the hill. Another filmmaker who was in charge of the film negatives, he started bleeding internally, and then when they went to develop his film while he was in the hospital, it was determined that it was unusable due to light contamination. So this also adds to that whole mystique about Dracula and there being a curse. Dracula has been used politically since the 1970s. If you may recall the name Nicolae Ceausescu, who was one of the last communist leaders of Romania. When Florescu was doing this research, Nixon just happened to be visiting Romania, and so they were looking for things to show Nixon, and the communist government got wind of what Florescu was researching, and Dracula had kind of been buried for a little bit. No, he wasn't as popular, and they saw this research, they looked back into it, and being a communist government needed a strong former ruler of Romania. They all of a sudden elevated Dracula back to the pedestal, and they made Dracula a national hero from Ceausescu's reign into the 1980s, and they even at one point were planning a theme park, a Dracula amusement park, which has been in limbo for the last 20 years. I don't think it's ever going to happen. Probably shouldn't happen. Are you going to walk in and get impaled? I don't know. Oh. Bram Stoker will be reading folklore from Transylvania. He'll be reading up on Vlad Dracula. And if you've ever read, who here has read the original Dracula by Bram Stoker? Okay, good. Very vivid in its descriptions. But he never actually visited Transylvania. He got these images from simply reading so many folklore books and reading the history of Vlad the Impaler. And Stoker, this is where tonight's talk veers from the history into the film, and how that's also a part of history in our pop culture. Stoker is a business manager. He becomes a novelist, and he wants to write something supernatural, something folkloric, and he will begin to write a history of Transylvania and vampires. But then he says, you know what, I have a novel here. I'm going to write an actual story. Originally, the main character was going to be Count Vampire, but then he discovers this Vlad Dracula character, and he says, that's a really good name. And could you imagine if the book was called anything other than what it was? I mean, Count Vampire? Like, give me a break. That's not good. But Dracula. And the original title was going to be The Undead, which would describe Dracula and all vampires. But just a week or two before publication, he changes his mind and just calls it simply Dracula. This book is going to be ahead of its time, and this is going to start to mark the vampire of popular culture of constantly pushing the boundaries of what we are reading and watching. You know, the horror genre had been very hit or miss in this country in the 1800s. Edgar Allan Poe, he made some great successes, but a lot of what he wrote really wasn't popular until after he dies. So Bram Stoker's writing this is going to elevate the horror genre. It's also going to open up a world of sexual liberation, which the vampire character is his means of doing. Think back to the Victorian era, what we know of it, very rigid, very stiff, religious, superstitious. They had terrible wallpaper, you know, all the things we know about the Victorians. And you couldn't talk about sex or sensuality. You couldn't talk about it. You certainly couldn't write it down. And so Bram Stoker is going to basically write multiple sex scenes in this book, but they are not true sex scenes because they are not between two people, but a monster upon its prey. Dracula not being a person attacking somebody who is human, they're not two people doing it. It's a monster and prey. And so it was allowed to be published because of that reason. And vampires are now going to change the course of literary history, and they are going to also eventually change the course of movie history as we get a little bit farther down. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. As she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white sharp teeth. Not too crazy, talking about licking lips and all of that, but in the Victorian era, to read something like this, people must have just had heart attacks and fainted while reading such a quote in that era. With his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn open dress. So he had obviously just bitten, started to feed, blood started to drip. While Stoker's Dracula is based on Vlad, there's only one exception. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but just slight references to Dracula fighting the Turks, which is a military reference, referencing Turkey, having gone to war, coming back where his troops were being slaughtered and then triumphing. So some slight historical connections. Would have been interesting to see, had he written this as a history, what he would have included. But what he will unknowingly do, because while the book was popular when it was first written, it really wasn't that bestseller until Stoker died, unfortunately. He will create the modern vampire, one of the most popular characters ever made that we see. There's fan fiction written in books, extended in magazines, and how many movies and TV shows and miniseries. They remake Dracula. Every year there's a new version of Dracula out there, some very faithful, some not. But he will die nearly destitute, the man that created this, this mega character. And it's kind of unfortunate. It's like so many artists that created beautiful paintings or wrote a great book, and then they die. And then all of a sudden, they are more popular than they were when they were alive, and it's just unfortunate. It's going to take until 1922, actually, for Dracula to go to the forefront of popularity, and that was with the movie Nosferatu being filmed in 1922, and a legal battle that will ensue over this depiction. Now, I asked before, a lot of people here have seen Nosferatu. I have some personal interest in this because the museum that I volunteer at, where I've been for the last 10 years, we show Nosferatu every year with live music. And we just had it 2 weeks ago, and we sell out every year. And it's a silent movie, of course, not everybody's cup of tea, but it sells out every year. Young people, old people, kids, you name it, every age you could possibly imagine, finding enjoyment in a silent movie. And that's because of the atmosphere, it's because of the story, and it's also because of the popularity that kind of stems from something illegal that went on during the production of this film. As early as 1916, there was talks of making a movie adaptation of Dracula. Bram Stoker was dead by now, and so they were going back and forth with the Stoker estate, trying to figure out how they could get the rights to the book. And the Stoker estate, mainly his wife, they did not like their interpretation. They didn't want to do it exactly the same, kind of wanted to use the name and change some things, and they didn't like it. They never gave permission. But by 1921, Prana Films will go into production of Dracula with major changes. One, Nosferatu is the title. Nosferatu is not the character, contrary to what you've seen on SpongeBob, those of you out there. His name is Count Orlok, so they changed the title. We're going to not get sued because we changed the title of the movie. Count Dracula becomes Count Orlok. The main character, who in the book was sexy and suave and filled with all of this energy, he becomes hideous and grotesque. Sunlight will kill the vampire rather than hinder. Dracula does not get killed by sunlight. It only weakens him. But in Nosferatu, the sunlight will actually kill Count Orlok. They eliminate many customary vampire traits. They eliminate some characters. They rename some others, doing all of this to just do as much as they can to distance themselves. And the famous scene that you've all seen in all the Dracula movies where Harker is cutting the bread and he cuts his finger and Dracula sees it and freaks out. That is actually not in Dracula. That was created by Nosferatu, and all of the other Dracula movies, including the Bela Lugosi version, copied that. Orlok's bite will cause a town-wide plague rather than create new vampires, which is actually more in line with how people truly felt in Eastern Europe when there was a vampire epidemic. This is the famous finger-pricking scene that's been repeated. I mean, every Dracula version has this in it. Max Schreck will be cast as Count Orlok, and you could argue he was the world's first method actor. He got into character, did everything short of drinking blood, although some legends have arose that on set he did drink blood. And there is a movie made about the making of Nosferatu called Shadow of the Vampire with Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck, and there's no better actor to play that character than Willem Dafoe. It shows, I mean, it's a fictitious movie. It goes into the folklore of the movie. So you have a movie about folklore developing its own folklore behind the scenes. And speaking of behind the scenes, this is Max Schreck in makeup. He just looks thrilled to be there. But he wore his makeup on set. He stayed in character, as so many actors now do. Daniel Day-Lewis played Abraham Lincoln. He was Abraham Lincoln for the year it took them to film that movie. Max Schreck, same thing. He was in character as a vampire for the duration of production. They made one mistake when they made this movie. They changed all the names. They did whatever they could. But in the opening credits, they left in freely adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Mrs. Stoker, this movie's premiering in Germany. She's in England. She has no idea this movie's even being made. She's the executor of his estate. She's struggling financially. She will receive an anonymous letter one day that says, "They're making a movie, Dracula. I was just at the premiere, and it said it's adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula. I didn't know you gave them permission for that." Well, that light bulb went off in her head. I got myself a lawsuit. And so she will take the filmmakers to court and demand not only financial reimbursement, but that every copy be destroyed. She didn't just want the money. She wanted nobody to see to see this film ever again. She will win the battle, but she loses the war. They do grant her. She does win the case, and they order those copies destroyed. But many of those copies managed to survive, including all the ones that were in the USA and any that went to a country that was not under the jurisdiction of that court. And so she did all that really for nothing. She does get some money out of it, but she was also concerned with people seeing this. Prana Films goes bankrupt. They only made one movie, which was Nosferatu. They go bankrupt to avoid paying because they just did not want anything to do with this. And the movie kind of slips away. It has this huge premiere and then disappears and will emerge in the late 1920s as people start to say, hey, we have copies of this movie. We should start showing it. And then she eventually dies. There is no real estate to go after. Well, still kind of, but they figured, well, we can show it now without getting sued. I consider this one of the first feminist movies, even though it is one of the first horror movie ever made and one of the first early films where there's an actual plot and cohesive editing. For most of history, as many minorities have been portrayed, women have generally been portrayed as helpless, the damsels in distress, especially in the horror movies. We've seen Scream Queens, right? The series, or they're just running around screaming. Think of all the slashers in the 70s, right? They're just getting chased and stabbed and screaming, and it's ridiculous. But as early as 1922, we have a female character who is a strong lead, and she will actually sacrifice herself to lure Count Orlok out at daybreak so that he will die, and thus saving the entire village. So she was not helpless, but she was in fact the hero of the movie. We also see various film technique in the production of this film. It's German expressionist. If you've seen old silent movies, a lot of times they're very fractured. It's just like one scene and another scene. There's not much flow. This actually has flow from one scene to the next. Silent movies were kind of difficult to film because of the pace of filming. The cameras were hand cranked, and that's why when you see some scenes in movies, you know, the characters are like walking really fast. That's because of the speed at which they're filming. So F.W. Murnau, the director, he has a metronome on set so that the actors can focus on that and slow down their acting. And it really does not look ridiculous when you see this movie, except for one scene towards the end where Count Orlok is carrying a coffin through the village and he's walking really, really fast. It's the only scene that really doesn't work. They filmed the entire movie with one camera on location in Slovakia. These were real buildings that they found, real villages. They did not build these sets. They will film with natural light, which causes confusion because the final scene when Orlok is walking outside in broad daylight, she should be dead, right? It's actually supposed to be nighttime, but they didn't have studio lighting to illuminate it. And so in a lot of copies of the film, they tinted the film blue so that people would think, okay, this was shot at night. Even the posters were ahead of their time. If you think back to old silent movie posters, they're very bland and blah. They have the actors' names on it, directed by, and maybe a small picture. But these are actually like true works of art, and they have become very valuable. Roger Ebert will say on Nosferatu, for those who have not seen it, here is the story of Dracula before it was buried alive in cliches, jokes, TV skits, cartoons, and more than 30 other films. The film is in awe of its material. It seems to really believe in vampires. Is Murnau's Nosferatu scary in the modern sense? Not for me. I admire it more for its artistry and ideas, its atmosphere and images, than for its ability to manipulate my emotions like a skillful modern horror film. It knows none of the later tricks of the trade like sudden threats that pop in from the side of the screen, but Nosferatu remains effective. It does not scare us, but it haunts us. And it really has a lot to do with that atmosphere. And it's a shame more people did not see it when it came out. And in fact, there were still people clamoring for a Dracula movie, and that's why 9 years later, we have the legally made studio film, Dracula. This would not have the controversy of the original. Carl Laemmle Jr., he legally purchases the rights from Bram Stoker's estate, and they study Nosferatu. And this is at a time in early Hollywood, whenever a remake was made, some cases they tried to destroy the original so that it was never seen again. You guys ever seen the movie Gaslight? with Ingrid Bergman. Yeah. So that was a remake of a movie also called Gaslight from just like 5 years earlier. Studio tried to buy up every copy of the original and destroy it so that people would only see the latest. So remakes were not necessarily a great thing for the artists that worked on these various projects, but rather than ignore Nosferatu, they studied it. And they tried to capture that German expressionism, which is in Dracula, and it's also in the early Universal Frankensteins. They will copy the finger-pricking scene, for example. Dracula had been a play on Broadway for many years. The actor was Bela Lugosi. However, he was not going to be considered for the role of the Count because he was virtually unknown. They didn't think it would be a big enough draw, and they looked at all of these other actors for the role. And Lugosi basically petitioned the studio. I need to play this role. He will lobby for it. He goes after the executives. You need to cast me. And he will accept a salary of $500 a week, which was less than what the actor playing Renfield was getting, who's only in it for a few moments, for the course of 7 weeks. Could you imagine any other actor in this role? Imagine Joseph Schildkraut playing that, just that voice. It just wouldn't work. He was perfect. The accent, the stare, the mannerisms, and of course he was perfect because he had played it on Broadway probably 1,000 times. This does, however, negatively affect Lugosi's career as much as it helps because he was willing to work for such a low amount of money. That's kind of where his career ended up going following Dracula. He could only get smaller roles. While Boris Karloff is in Frankenstein and the Mummy and becomes a superstar, Bela Lugosi's career doesn't quite go that way. The production was a bit disorganized. Sound movies are still relatively new. Todd Browning, the director, who does a fantastic job, he's unfamiliar and uncomfortable with making sound movies. Because in silent movies, obviously there's no talking. And so when characters are talking, it looks different than it would in a sound movie. And so he doesn't really know how to set it up. And if you watch a lot of the movie, kind of looks like a silent film, the way some of the scenes are staged. There is no soundtrack. There's hardly any background noise whatsoever. You can just hear the hum of the whatever audio devices they were recording it with. Dracula's transitions, all going to be off camera. He's not going to turn into a bat in front of the camera because they did not have the special effects capability. And there were no special effects used at all, except for fog, lighting, and yes, there are some mechanical bats that will fly through the air. This is the first of its kind, the first full-length sound horror movie, and it is only the second full-length serious movie to have no comic relief whatsoever, as it was felt at the time, if it was a serious topic, there needs to be some kind of joke or something funny to break it up because the audiences won't be able to handle it. But they ignore all of that. There is no humor whatsoever in Dracula, and it was seen as a gamble, but it was a gamble that paid off, pulls in about $700,000. Variety magazine writes, it is difficult to think of anybody who could quite match the performance in the vampire part of Bela Lugosi, even to the faint flavor of foreign speech that fits so neatly. New York Times loved it, and this will inspire the rest of the Universal monster films, The Mummy, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Invisible Man. Audience reaction. It's kind of like the original Exorcist. People fainted at the premiere. Now, The Exorcist I can understand. This, I don't know why anybody would faint. Lugosi, in staring directly into the camera, people couldn't conceive of that, like he was looking directly at you, and when he sticks his hand out, they thought they were going to get possessed or fall under his spell. And this made people very uneasy, and as uneasy as it made them, they still wanted more. And they could not get enough of vampires. There is going to be some censorship. There's two things. When Dracula finally gets killed, they drive the stake through the heart. It's off camera, but you hear the sound of the hammer hitting the stake, and then he groans. The groan was actually eliminated in the original copy because they thought that the staking sound was enough and it was too much if the audience had to hear him scream out in pain. This groan has since been restored to every other copy that's out there. So unless you were alive in 1932 and saw this, you have all seen we've all seen the same version. There was also an epilogue at the end of the movie where Edward Van Sloan, who plays Van Helsing, says, "Just a moment, ladies and gentlemen, a word before you go. We hope the memories of Dracula and Renfield won't give you bad dreams, so just a word of reassurance. When you get home tonight and the lights have been turned out and you are afraid to look behind the curtains and you dread to see a face appear at the window, why, just pull yourself together and remember that after all, there are such things as vampires." Religious groups got offended because it encouraged a belief in the supernatural. They wanted an epilogue that said what you just saw was fiction, blah, blah, blah. So what the studio did was they just cut the epilogue altogether. It still exists on YouTube. This would spark a whole industry of horror movies. Unfortunately, the sequel, Dracula's Daughter, did not have room for Bela Lugosi. By this point, he wanted more money, and they didn't want to pay him. So funny how that all worked out. And so they make this movie without him. And it's an okay movie, but obviously not as good without him. Unlike the Hammer Studios Dracula films, which I'm going to show you in 1 second, they did not keep bringing Dracula to life over and over again, killing him at the end of every movie, bringing him back again. They killed him in 1931, and they left him dead. There was a Spanish version that was filmed right alongside with the English version. Same sets, same cameras. And there are some people who believe that that is actually superior to the English version. Hammer Studios will buy the rights to all of the Universal horror movies, and they remake Mummy, The Werewolf, Frankenstein, Invisible Man, all of them. But it is the Dracula films that, again, push the boundaries, as this was the first vampire movie to show blood in color. And people got to see that vibrant red liquid spurting out of people's necks and dripping all over the place. And they weren't horrified. They loved it. They loved it so much that they had to kill him and bring him back 7 times. Horror of Dracula. They renamed it Horror of Dracula because in the late 50s they started re-showing the original 1931 version in some theaters, and so they wanted to make sure people knew what they were watching. This is a very close remake of the 1932 version. He dies a little bit differently, but it's an excellent film. It's filmed in beautiful Technicolor, and if you can get an HD version of it on various streaming services, it really does pop. It's very vibrant. They make a second movie, Brides of Dracula, kind of like Bride of Frankenstein, without Christopher Lee, who was Count Dracula. But it wasn't as popular, and so they had to bring him back again in Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and then kill him and bring him back again over and over again. And every time he said, "This was it, I'm not doing another Dracula movie," Hammer would go to him and say, "The studio's going to be bankrupt, where so many people are going to be out of work," and he'd say, "All right, I'll do one more." And every single one of them was a success. Even Satanic Rites of Dracula, which is not very good, it was still a success. He is a different kind of Dracula, unlike Bela, who's very calm and sedate and mystifying. Christopher Lee's Dracula pops. There's this rage, there's this violence. He's angry, he's fast, and he speaks a lot less than any other Dracula. In 7 movies, he has only 9 minutes of dialogue, yet his bites take up 6 minutes. And in fact, in the 3rd film, he says to Peter Cushing, longtime friend and actor with him in so many movies, he says, "I don't have any lines." And Cushing says, "Lucky you, I've read the script." So he, was back and forth. He wanted to have more lines, but his character was somehow more menacing without speaking. And yes, if you watch Dracula, Prince of Darkness, he does not say one word in the entire movie. But it's almost a better performance than the ones where he speaks, because the lines written for him were just way too dramatic and ridiculous. He's taller than Bela, and there's a satanic element to his Dracula. So I really, most of them are available right now for free on streaming services because it's October. You really should look into it. Maybe tonight if you haven't had enough of vampires after this. So I kind of talked about that already. People have not had enough. They can't get their fill. Some other interpretations, Lon Chaney Jr., John Carradine, Frank Langella, who is in a very good Dracula adaptation. It did not do well at the box office, but it's actually very good. Laurence Olivier is in it as Van Helsing. Jack Palance is in a very little-known Dracula movie directed by Dan Curtis, who gave us House of Shadows. And this is the most talkative Dracula. And it's almost 3 hours long. And at first I was watching it for the first time last year, and I'm like, he talks so much. Like, it's almost weird, because Lugosi didn't talk that much. Lee hardly talked at all. But it really helps you relate to him as a character. And so I really recommend that one. Gary Oldman in the Francis Ford Coppola version, which was pretty good. They remade Nosferatu in 1979 with Klaus Kinski, and they are remaking it yet again next year. Robert Eggers, who directed The Witch and The Lighthouse and The Northman, he is directing the guy, Peter Skarsgård, who was the clown in It. He is going to be Count Orlok. So that's going to be very good. It's going to be in black and white as well. And there's rumors it might be silent too. We have Blackula. I just watched this one for the first time last week, Dracula Dead and loving it. If you've seen Young Frankenstein, it's the Dracula version. It's very well made. It's not as funny. It just kind of falls a little flat. Vampires have taken so many forms. It pained me to put them in the presentation, but they are part of vampire pop culture and lore. And really, when you look at the characters of vampires, the history, the myth, they've taken on so many different forms. They've taken so many people in. People love vampires. And it's one of those things where, when we look at, say, witchcraft as well, that for such a long part of history, people were absolutely terrified of these creatures, of witches being real, of vampires being real. And now here we are, 200-300 years later, we're dressing up like them. We have them in our cereal. You know, we absolutely love vampires. And what would the people of the 1600s have thought, thinking that we'd be doing a talk like this and not being terrified, but just enjoying vampires for what they are? They've always been there to push the boundaries in literature and film. They've been necessary, because we've been very rigid in our history with books and movies and censorship, and it's taken the vampire to kind of get us out of that and get us to a point where we could be a little bit more free in our artistic expression. So on that note, I want to wish you all a very happy Halloween season, very happy October, my favorite time of year, and I thank you all for coming tonight. We'll see you next year. We're History of Liquor and Prohibition. Thank you very much.